Hey, what's going on, everyone? Thank you for tuning in and checking out my latest video. And this week's video is going to be about a living legend and former heavyweight boxing champion, George Foreman. And I really wanted to do this video because Bernard Hopkins on Saturday night had his big win at age 49. So I kind of wanted to relive the comeback that George Foreman went on. And I also reached out to a respected boxing trainer to get his thoughts on George Foreman. And also I want to say rest in peace to Reuben Hurricane Carter. So let's get right into the career of George Foreman. So George Foreman's a guy with a record of 76 victories and 5 losses. 68 of those wins come via KO. And in 1968, George Foreman won the Olympic gold medal with very little amateur experience. And when I look back at George Foreman, I see a guy with a very hard, crisp jab, a guy with an underrated chin, throws some nice uppercuts, ability to cut off the ring, a very strong fighter, one of the hardest hitters in the sport of boxing. So this is a guy who I've been very impressed with, the brute sheer power that this guy had early on in his career. And now I want to relive some memorable fights that George Foreman was in. So the first matchup I want to speak to you guys about is a matchup between him and Joe Frazier. So in this matchup with Joe Frazier, happened in 1973 in Kingston, Jamaica. And George Foreman just brutally destroyed Joe Frazier. He backed him up on the ropes, hit him with left-right combinations, ended up dropping Joe Frazier with some uppercuts, which I mentioned were one of his strongest punches at the beginning of the video. And Joe Frazier got knocked down 6 times in this matchup. And Howard Cosell doing the commentary had the legendary saying, "Down goes Frazier." And that's where that came from, was that matchup. And George Foreman wins in the second round via stoppage. So that was a very big victory in George Foreman's career against a Hall of Fame fighter. The next matchup I want to get into is a 1974 matchup between him and Ken Norton. So this matchup, it started off fairly even in the first round, but around the 6-minute mark of the fight, George Foreman ends up clipping Ken Norton, and that spelled the end for Ken Norton. George Foreman ends up knocking him down 3 times and stops him in the second round. So he defeated 2 Hall of Fame fighters very early on in fights, and Ken Norton was a guy who defeated Muhammad Ali in his career, so that's very impressive. And the next matchup I want to speak to you guys is a matchup between him and Ron Lyle. This is a very underrated heavyweight classic fight in my opinion. So early on in this matchup, George Foreman had to use that chin because George Foreman got rocked in this fight. And he comes back and actually ends up defeating Ron Lyle, unleashing a flurry of punches with no response from Lyle, and Lyle hits the deck and he was out. So that was a huge victory from George Foreman. I'm going to post that underneath because that was a really classic matchup, and Ron Lyle was another tough guy and a good fighter as well. And I just want to give you guys some comments from some former opponents of George Foreman speaking about his power. George Chavello likened George Foreman's blows to getting hit by a 45-mile-per-hour Mack truck. And Evander Holyfield said George Foreman hit him the hardest that he had been hit in his career. And Evander Holyfield, if you remember, was a guy who fought Mike Tyson as well. And now I want to get into probably George Foreman's most famous matchup in 1974, the Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire. So in this matchup, George Foreman has all the confidence in the world. And in the fight, he's doing pretty well. He has Muhammad Ali up against the ropes, landing some big body shots, some heavy blows. But in this matchup, Muhammad Ali implemented the rope-a-dope strategy, where George Foreman would tire himself out landing all these power punches as Ali was in the corner on the ropes. And eventually that's what happened. So George Foreman tired himself out. In the 8th round, Muhammad Ali unleashes a flurry. We see George Foreman spin down the canvas, gets counted out at 10. And George Foreman had just lost his title. And a fight where he had against Jimmy Young in 1977, he lost that matchup. And after the fight in his dressing room, he had a very religious moment where he said God spoke to him. And after that incident, he began preaching and left the sport for 10 years. And later on in his career, George Foreman ends up coming back after his 10 years out of boxing. And most people thought, is this guy crazy? I mean, boxing's a young man's game. And when we saw George Foreman come back, well, he wasn't the same fighter he was early on in his career. He couldn't come out and just walk guys down, destroy them like he did early on. He used patience and he had to use his actual boxing skills to win fights a lot of the time, not just sheer brute physical strength. And he early on when he in his comeback, he got a shot against Evander Holyfield for the heavyweight championship, ends up losing that fight. But he shows a ton of heart and excellent chin because Evander Holyfield landed tons of punches in that matchup. But down the road, 3 years later, George Foreman ends up getting a shot at Michael Moorer for the heavyweight championship. And in this matchup, George Foreman is getting completely dominated on the cards. But what Michael Moorer didn't know is that George Foreman was setting him up for a big 1-2. On the HBO documentary, it's very good if you haven't checked it out. They have basically explaining this matchup. George Foreman threw a left hook a couple times to the body to move Michael Moorer over so he could land his jab as a rangefinder and hit him with that 1-2. And the unthinkable happened down on the cards in round 10. George Foreman connects on the 1-2. The final blow, his right hand, knocks out Michael Moorer, and this is one of the most amazing comebacks and inspiring fights I've ever seen in my life in the sport of boxing. George Foreman at age 45 knocks out Michael Moorer and becomes the heavyweight champion of the world after losing his title 20 years ago to Muhammad Ali at that point. And he also had the same red trunks on that he wore during his fight against Muhammad Ali, so it was like a very redemption-style fight for George Foreman. And that was huge for his career and showed what kind of champion and legend this guy was in the sport of boxing. And some people want to know, what is George Foreman doing outside of the ring nowadays? Well, of course, he has his infamous grill, the George Foreman Youth Center, very active on Twitter, class act to the fans. And George Foreman also is involved with Foreman Boys Promotions, so you should definitely check that out. And I rank George Foreman is one of the top 10 best heavyweights of all time. And now I want to leave you guys with some comments from respected trainer John Scully. This is a man who trained the last fighter to defeat Bernard Hopkins, which was Chad Dawson. Very respected trainer and a historian of the sport. So I want to leave you with his comments, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video about the living legend George Foreman. Thank you.